Hey guys, it's Logan here with Hydra 572. Today I'm going to be reviewing a Spyderco Endura 4, full flat ground as you guys can see with these stylish blue handles. Some of you may remember I've reviewed an Endura before, the cool Bayou Shooter Sprint Run with the OD green handles, black coated blade with an Emerson opener. To summarize that review, it was a really cool knife, but it had some quality control issues with blade play, and the blade not necessarily locking into position when you flicked it open real fast, and the blade rubbing on the inside of the handles. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense as a tactical knife because it just felt flimsy. I didn't want to use it for defensive use, and the blade profile wasn't really conducive for EDC cutting either. This blade is free from all but one of those issues. It still has more side-to-side blade play and up and down blade play than I would prefer, but overall I like this knife quite a bit better. Let's hop in with intended usage. We already basically covered it. This is what I would call a medium size or a backup utility cutter, but what most people would refer to as a large knife for EDC use. You could also use it for emergency defensive if you had to protect yourself. Moving on to pricing, this thing costs about $68.95 plus shipping on Blade HQ. Price fluctuates up and down on Amazon, eBay, all that sort of thing. You can catch them quite a bit cheaper than that if you look around and are patient. Moving on to the blade profile, as you guys can see there, the tip is pretty acute. I think during normal use it wouldn't be a problem, but if you tried to pry on it, this would break earlier than some others. However, it does provide for some pretty acute tip cutting, which is nice. Belly, for an EDC folder, we don't really have a lot. I think if you use this knife hard on cardboard, you're going to end up sharpening this portion of the blade a whole lot more than this portion down here, just by nature of going to slicing, having that being the part that touches first. Then onto the steel, we have VG10, which is a decent steel. I would say it's comparable to other budget steels like 8CR13 MOV and Always But One, and that is this steel resists corrosion much better. In terms of cutting performance, sharpenability, and edge holding ability, I think edge geometry is going to matter a whole lot more than steel choice when you're talking about steels like this. Now, somebody might say that for all steels what matters most is edge geometry, and I would agree. However, when you're talking about VG10 versus 8CR13, the edge geometry is going to make up a much more significant portion of that battle than it would 154cm against 8CR13 MOV. What I'm saying is it's kind of a crapshoot. It's a very nice steel. It's very easy to sharpen. I've said for a while now that Spyderco tends towards a little bit softer steel that will lose its edge a little bit faster, but is that much easier to sharpen up. And I do kind of prefer that as well. It's no trouble for me to strap a blade back up or to slap it on the sharp maker. Others who can't sharpen a knife very easily might prefer a little bit harder steel that they don't have to sharpen, but then when it does come time to sharpen, it can be a major pain in the ass. It's a trade-off, and this is a pretty good trade-off. It'll work really well as an EDC cutter. When it starts to dull, slap it on a sharp maker if you're lucky enough to have one, and you should. Otherwise, strop it up. You can do a cardboard strop. It will just take quite a long time. Moving on to grind, you can see there we have a full flat grind. That is an excellent utility cutter. Grind, it will have a little bit diminished performance in cuts where not very much of the blade is engaged, simply because it will have more material behind the cutting edge than, say, a hollow ground knife would, but it makes up for it in any kind of cut where the entire blade is going to be engaged, where you have material pinching on both sides of the knife, which make up a good portion of utility cutting tasks as well. It's a trade-off, but you don't lose much performance in those slicing kinds of tasks, so I do tend to like full flat ground knives for EDC usage, and this one worked just fine for me in that role. Moving on to deployment, we have the Spidey hole, as you can see, used there as a thumb stud. You could also put a zip tie through there, use it as a wave opener. I would say that would be a good option for people who wanted to deploy this knife quickly. There are all sorts of ways to do that mod with some class. I've always preferred to just stick the zip tie on through there, zip it up, and cut it off. Back to grind really quickly. This will be a little bit of a pain in the ass if you're using a system like an Edge Pro Apex or a Wicked Edge where you need to have a flat to either clamp the blade on or lay the blade on. There are different ways to tackle that with both systems. With the Wicked Edge, I tried to clamp it back here and it seemed to work all right. Back here around the thumb ramp, it is a pretty flat portion. I got the clamp on relatively well. Moving on to our lock, you guys can see here we have a back lock with a David Bowie dent, supposed to prevent you from accidentally actuating the lock and letting the blade close on your fingers. I'm not really sure if it works in that endeavor or not. It's a little bit more comfortable to have a notch for your thumb to go into. No big deal though. I do like back locks. Some people are turned off by them. However, backlocks in Spyderco's FRN handled blades do tend to have that endemic blade play, a little bit side to side, a little bit up and down, typically more than I would like as we move into play. That is a quality control concern on a knife that costs that much. You might end up paying $50 for it. It shouldn't have as much blade play as it does. If you cinch that pivot up anymore, then it doesn't deploy very smoothly, and that's a bummer as well. As we move into handles, we have FRN with Spyderco's bidirectional texturing here, and the more knives that I have with the bidirectional texturing, the more I like it, the more I notice that it does provide pretty good traction without being really invasive, without cutting your hands up, anything like that, roughing your hands up. It is a pretty comfortable high traction material, and it does work. When wet, I had this knife out in the snow on a shooting expedition with me a little while ago, and it performed very well. Inside we have skeletonized steel to save weight. I'm not sure we're getting the stiffness that we would want out of that steel. Not sure why that would be. Just tends to be a problem with Spyderco's FRN handled blades. Moving on to the ergonomics, I've always said that the Endura series has this weird ergonomic effect where if you just grasp the blade without paying much attention to the way that you're picking it up, your hand finds its way into a comfortable position. If you try to really think about it and start maneuvering your hand around, then it gets less comfortable. I'm not really sure why. I think it has to do with this wide but not very deep first choil, and then the way the rest of the handle is built. For me to be comfortable, I need to sort of get this knuckle right into the bottom of that choil, be back here on the thumb ramp, and then it is pretty comfortable. During cutting tasks, it is a very comfortable knife. Some of the discomfort starts to happen just based on that this blade is not very thick and you've got to push your thumb into it to cut. But that's going to happen with any thin knife, and I think thin and compact is part of what they were going with this blade. They packed a relatively large blade into a small package, and a lot of people get off on that. Moving into the jimping and the thumb ramp, they are both perfection. This is a fine grade jimping, and it is very tacky without being sharp. I am in love with Spyderco's jimping. No matter how they do it, if they do fine, if they do larger jimping, like on the Resilience, they just know how to design a good thumb ramp, and the Endura is no exception. I very much like that jimping. The clip also is great. Spyderco tends to do the little things very well. Their clip, some people, I've heard a couple of people that I respect say that they don't like it, but it just works really good for me. They tend to give you deep carry with enough to grab onto to pull that knife out of your pants, and yeah, it just works. It's four-way reversible, very comfortable, non-intrusive on your hand. I like it quite a bit. Good hourglass stamped steel design, it just works. Moving into presentation, another weird quality of the Endura is that it's a very difficult knife to take pictures of, but one that when it's in hand, it feels very good and looks very good. So it's difficult to get a good camera angle on it to show what it actually looks like when you're holding it in your hand. That's a weird thing to say, but it is true nonetheless. So I think that it looks very good in hand. Pictures tend to be a little bit untrue. I don't know how to describe that any better, but if it looks attractive to you in a picture, it's going to look better in person. I'll just leave it that way. Moving on to the quality, as I said, Spyderco tends to do the simple things very well. Their pivots are well made. They don't have to be tightened very often. Same thing with all of their body screws, their locks, all of those things, which makes it a little bit disappointing that we've got the play to put up with. I wish that we didn't have that issue. There's even a little bit less play on my Resilience, which is a little bit cheaper and produced overseas. So there you go. Actually, I think this knife is produced, yep, this knife is produced in Seki City in Japan, so they're both overseas. The Tenacious line, I believe, is China, however. Moving on to the value, we have VG10 and FRN handles for around 50 bucks if you shop around, maybe a little bit more, 50, 60 bucks. And so that's good value. It's not a knockout, but it gets the job done all right. Most people, if they were looking for a utility cutter and they picked this knife up, they would not be disappointed. Moving on to the competition, well, in this price range for a utility cutter, you just have so damn much competition. I've always said that Spyderco tends to heavily compete with their own blades. Reference the Spyderco Resilience, a little bit larger, quite a bit more comfortable in my opinion. Same great full flat ground blade profile for EDC. Also a very excellent blade, strong competition. Moving a little bit smaller, within the Spyderco family, we have the Spyderco Native. Better steel, similar price, a little bit smaller. Similar thing with ergonomics where you sort of have to just groove with this knife's ergonomics, but I love it. That is a badass blade. Moving on to some other brands. Same size around as the Native, similar price range, better steel in my opinion with the Sandvik. We have the Kershaw Echelon, a very cool blade, a little bit more new age looking than our Endura. And a little bit cheaper option than all of these, great knife, the Ontario Rat 1. Haven't seen this guy out in a while since I thrashed on the lock bar, but it is doing just fine. Great knife, strong competition, very similar in design. I would say more comfortable than the Spyderco Endura. So what I'm trying to make the point at here is even just pulling knives from my collection, there's a whole lot of very strong competition for the Endura, and it's just competing in a packed division, really. Utility cutters around 60 bucks are a lot of what knife companies want to sell. They believe they can get people to spend that much, and utility cutters are what most people want to buy. There's not a whole lot of people going out and buying huge cold steel Voyagers, much as I think they should. Most people are in the market for something this size or smaller. They want to use it as a utility cutter. You guys have seen my EDC videos. I would prefer to have a large defensive folder on me, pack this thing in a back pocket so that I can keep the edge on my large folder pristine. A lot of people are going to use this blade as a utility cutter. So then we go to pass or fail. I gave it a pass. The thing about knives that have a whole lot of competition is the one that you're going to like is going to be heavily influenced by the way that it fits in your hand, the way that you like a specific blade profile, and I can't really dictate those sort of things for you. It would be very beneficial if you could go to a hardware store in your area, Cabela's, anything like that, where you could go and get hands-on with some knives, maybe check out your friends' knives and see what just feels good in your hand. The Endura is not really built for my hand ergonomically. I'm not a huge fan. Like I said, they've always been a little bit weird in my mind. The more coffin-style grips of the Resilience or the Rat 1 I find to be significantly more comfortable. That doesn't mean everyone does. I've found multiple conversations of people online discussing how the Endura is the perfect ergonomics for their hand, and I see what they're talking about. It's a little bit slim. Referencing back to that intended usage, a lot of people are going to use this as a light, low-profile EDC cutter that has a large blade. And it does a lot of things right. I'm just, for some reason, not as stoked on it as I am on some other blades. That's not really a negative reflection on this knife. It might have something to do with the earlier one that I had that had quality control issues. Not sure, really. But it is a very competently executed knife. Spyderco hits another one. I won't say out of the park, but it does very well. It's a stylish knife. Going back to presentation, I really like that little plate there that they have. Just a little touch sets it off just a little bit, and I always appreciate it when companies offer different choices for handle material color. That's very nice as well. I'm glad to be able to pick purple or green or blue or whatever I want. It helps mix up the rigmarole of black, black. You know, there's a lot of black stuff in my collection, and that's good. I like that look, but I like color as well. So you guys can see I do try pretty hard to keep some color in my collection. So I appreciate Spyderco for being one of the first companies that offered that interchangeability and that selection of having different handle colors on the same knife. At this point, I'm just rambling. What I wanted to get across about the Spyderco Endura, full flat ground, it is a very competently executed EDC cutter. There are some things that I would tweak, what with the blade play, and I might even think about adding a small portion on top for a consistent angle sharpener to clamp onto, but overall, it is a very well-designed knife. You can choke up on it a little bit more. I find that to be less comfortable, trying to cram 2 fingers into that finger choil there, but it does give you some more fine control. A very competently executed blade in terms of quality, minus the play, presented very well with those color choice options and with that little plate. I think it's just a nice looking knife. The value is okay. Spyderco has managed before to give us better steel, similar handles in a little bit smaller of a blade, but I think a more stylish one as well. So like I said, it's sort of a crapshoot at this point. You have to go get hands-on with the blades and decide what you like, because all of those blades that I showed are very good through Hall of Fame for me. And so, yeah, there's just a lot of competition. This is a great blade. And to answer the question that I posed in the Bayou Shooter review of this similar knife, I think the Endura does still hold up. I think it competes very well. It might not be the knife for me, but I'm sure there are many people out there who are going to love it. Thank you guys for watching. Stay tuned for more of the same.